Hi, I'm Kayleigh Frost, Head of Clinical Support at Health Assured, and I'm joined today by Martin. Hi Martin, you okay?
Hello, yes, thank you. Very well, thank you.
Good,
You
good.
okay?
Yes, I'm fantastic,
Good.
thank you. So Martin, you're one of our counsellors at Health Assured. How long have you been a counsellor for?
Well, I've worked at Health Assured since January.
Yeah.
I qualified...
Has it only been since January?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I qualified as a counsellor 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a pandemic that made it
It's a little
different.
bit of a thing.
Made it different. We all learned to work on telephones and on Zoom and Teams and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually really helpful for a lot of people.
Yes.
Particularly people who don't want to go to a room and see someone. So I think that can be really helpful, particularly for people who might be talking about today.
Absolutely, yes. So the topic for today's podcast is neurodiversity. So I think it's quite a hot topic in terms of people asking more questions. People are wanting to know more about neurodiversities, what that means for individuals, how it might impact them. So whilst it's a very, very broad subject and we could talk about it and cover so many episodes, we'll go quite high level in terms of understanding what neurodiversity means, how it impacts individuals, and kind of what could be included within the scope of neurodiversities as well. So I know from outside of this podcast that you have an interest in neurodiversity, which is amazing, and I've seen you speak at events, which was amazing to see.
Thank you.
You were absolutely fantastic. Have you had a passion, maybe passion, is that the right word? An interest in neurodiversity support? Has that been quite a big thing for you?
Yeah. And thinking particularly in terms of counselling and my professional life, maybe in the last 7 or 8 years, I did a lot of work with young people and started to notice that I particularly liked working with people who were a little bit different, particularly people with autism. And then I made that my job, which was amazing. I worked with young people with learning difficulties, but particularly people with autism who didn't really have learning difficulties, but they were with us anyway, and other people had different struggling with other different things. And then I got myself qualified, doing a master's level qualification in autism, and then thought, how can I help people? Actually, I think I'm going to learn to be a counsellor, because it's really, and my expertise is in autism. I do have knowledge of other neurodiversities, we'll talk about them in a minute, but I think that some of the autistic students I work with found it really difficult to get hold of counselling. It was seen as too specialist. There was very lack of provision, particularly in the NHS, and I saw the difference it made to someone. I can always remember the person I worked with. It was amazing, like a different person, because they'd had some counselling to help them understand themselves. And they happen to have autism, but other neurodiversities as well. It's just that learning who you are and being happy with who you are, which is essentially a big role for counselling for a lot of people. But it's particularly important when you've lived in a world where you can't quite make sense of it because it's a little bit different than you. And you just feel a bit different from everyone else because you don't quite keep up with things, and people have expectations of you that aren't quite what you might have of yourself, and things like that. And it's just generally learning to be comfortable with that. So I learned to be a counsellor to help people, particularly with those, because not many people did. And I think so I have been able to do that, which I've been very privileged to do. So
that's so inspiring. What a lovely what a lovely journey into your profession that is, and being able to, we know that counselling is very vocational for practitioners, and quite often it comes as a second or third career. It comes after
about 10th for me.
10th career
at least
hopefully the 10th and final. But it
maybe.
does happen because of some you might call it divine intervention, or something that you go through, or something that you experience. We saw a lot of people retraining as a result of the pandemic as well, and the impact that that's had. But that, I'm inspired by every counsellor that goes through their journey into being a counsellor or a practitioner. But yours sounds really special in that way.
Thank you.
No, it really is, and it's really, and I hope you never forget that, that first person, that you'll never forget that. So that really is special. That really is something. So thank you for sharing that as well. I guess then for anyone that's listening and doesn't really understand what neurodiversity means, they just see that word bandied about, they've seen it, people ask questions but they don't fully understand it. How would you explain neurodiversity?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a diverse subject in itself.
It is, yeah.
Just to make a rather silly wordplay, but yeah, I think it's a difficult. Yeah, I think it's someone who's neurodiversity is about everybody's brain works a bit differently.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody's does.
Yeah.
Some people's brains are particularly biased towards some things and working in a particularly different way.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is not going to be a complete list, but neurodiversities might include autism or Asperger's syndrome, my speciality, people with ADHD, which is badly named attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We'll come to that later. Tourette's syndrome might be an example, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. Well, there's quite negatively named, that dys word at the front, and again we'll talk about that as we move along. So those sort of things, and it touches a lot of people's lives, either because they have one of those, or they are close to someone who has, or they work with someone who has, and just and I think it's often neurodiversity isn't the neurodiversity, it's the fitting in with everybody else who's different that's hard. And I think so it's almost like definable by society in a way, which isn't necessarily good, I think.
No, it isn't. And right, you've mentioned the negative connotations, to do with the names, the labels, the conditions. Talk to me a little bit more about that, because you're talking about this just the negative connotations.
I mean, people there's so many different ways of talking about people, but people with autism or autistic people, and then people talk about, it's still very common, it's one of the diagnostic words in the American guides for diagnosing people, autistic spectrum disorder. Well, hang on a minute. Disorder? Who said it's a disorder? I mean, actually what it means is the rest of the world is struggling to fit in with you, or the other way around, and so I think I probably prefer condition. I think disorder is just not helpful, because actually there are many people with autism who do brilliantly, and probably more people who would do better if the world was a bit better arranged, in terms of people. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Attention deficit? Are you joking? I mean, some people with ADHD, or whatever you want to call it, I don't have a better name for it, I'm afraid. They're kind of that sort of real focus on something that's really interesting. Oh, they didn't behave well at school. Why was that? It was because actually quite a lot of school's quite boring for most people, and most people have a brain that is able to kind of cope with that to a certain extent, but some people's brains will not let them do that because they want to do what they're really interested in. And I think if you can find that thing you're really interested in, that's brilliant. But again, it's that definition by people who don't have that neurodiversity based on observable features. So, attention deficit, they're not listening to what I say. They must have a problem with their attention. Or what you're saying isn't very interesting. And hyperactive, well, they're probably bored. They're looking at something else to do. Disorder, not necessarily. There's some hugely successful neurodiverse people. There's some people who are very happy with neurodiversities. And there are people who don't know they've got them because they're not defined by that. So I think Chris Packham, who's to me a brilliant natural history person. I grew up with Chris Packham, not literally, just on TV. And he said in a program he did about autism, when I'm alone, I'm not autistic. So, he would say from that, he's only autistic when he's got to deal with other people. So it's not a condition he has, it's something that's sort of society has, really. So that's an interesting way of looking at it.
I'd never even thought of it in this way. That is, literally me sat here right now, like eye-opening to even think of it in that way. We've seen it before. So when you spoke at the event, our conference, I was kind of sat there thinking you made reference to how people would just allude to someone with autism as being one type of person, ADHD, the naughty hyperactive. That's how I had always seen or believed someone with ADHD to be. And it's only now, probably in the last 18 months, that there's been more awareness on social media about people coming forward with their conditions, and you'd think, they're not who I thought. They don't look like someone that's autistic, which is so awful that we've as society have forged those images and visuals of representations of what someone with autism, ADHD, for example, looks like.
Absolutely. When I was a kid, I think I probably at some point knew the term autism, and that meant the kid who's in the corner of the special school not talking and probably rocking a bit. Well, some people with autism do that. Well, that's fine, but many people don't. And I think kind of probably a group of people who maybe counsellors are more likely to encounter are people who have developed those skills to fit in with society, one way or another, but have had to work really hard at that. And it's that hard work that's the difficulty, I think. I think in terms of counselling, if I'm going to work with someone with autism, I'm not helping them with autism. I can't do anything about that.
No.
What I can do is help them think about how they might fit into other people or get other people to fit in with them, which would be much better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because fitting in with other people is really hard. You're essentially acting 24/7. You're trying to be someone else, which I guess if you've got a professional actor, and said, right, can you act for 6 months and stay in character? I think that's quite hard. I think that has quite a toll on you.
Huge strain,
especially if you don't do that, your whole life falls apart. You lose your job, you fall out with people, everything goes badly wrong, and you have to do that. That's hugely hard work, and I think you have to just constantly make your brain do something it doesn't naturally want to do. That's all the time. That's really hard, and I think that's something that people don't realise. So those sort of hidden neurodiversities, people aren't noticing. And often people who do that are very intelligent and capable because they have to be in order to have gained those coping strategies. Yeah. So if someone's working that hard, people have expectations of them. So you have expectations of someone who does really well in their job that they'll be able to do something different, and they can't because actually that's the thing that's really hard. So someone who's really successful in their job, you might say, oh, they're very competent. They're really good at organising, running a hotel or something. They've done really well, really good at that. Oh, they'll be great at coming and doing the introductory speech to my dinner party or whatever. Or dinner. And they're terrible. And it's because they haven't learned how to do that. That's really hard for them. They've just been hiding that in their other job.
And working for over a long period of time to create
persona,
an image. Yeah.
So when you expect them to do something that's actually really hard, you're disappointed they can't do it because you have expectations of them. Yeah.
And that will have implications for that person if there is disappointment or negative feedback, and that could undo years of hard work of them building this person that they've had to become to fit in amongst everyone else.
Good example would be a young person at school who has dyslexia but is also really intelligent. They work out ways around that. They work out ways of doing it, and they're bright, so they come up with all the answers at school. The primary school thinks they're fine because they seem to know everything, but then they get to secondary school and they're expected to write essays. And they write these essays, and it's like, actually, this is horrendous for them. And the teacher's constantly disappointed and thinks they're not trying hard enough because their spelling's not very good, and they don't appear to be making an effort, and they haven't written enough words. And actually, these kids are going home in tears every night because this is so hard for them, and they really want to do as well as they can because they've been a high-flying student, and because there's an expectation on them, a reasonable expectation from what they've done before. We think in a neurotypical world, actually, it's really hard for them.
Is that something you saw quite a lot when you worked with young people?
Not me personally, I think, because the job I was doing sort of allowed for that. And I have to say that most schools are much better at dealing with things like dyslexia now because there's much more recognition. I think ADHD maybe not so much, but it does help when people have that diagnosis, which I think we'll come on to in a bit. But I think it's when it's not really noticed, possibly even by the person themselves, that can be really hard, and you go through life being brilliant at appearing to be okay, but actually you're not okay, but you've learnt to not be okay for a very long time, but it still takes a toll on you.
You touched before on, in the counselling practice, and when people that are neurodiverse come to the counselling, come to the therapy room, I say, or reach out and start working with a counsellor, then that is someone, usually you said, that might have worked out to become highly functioning.
Well, they've got a job. That makes them quite rare in autistic world compared with non-autistic world.
So there's such a divide there, isn't there? You almost have to have a certain level of, I don't know if privilege is the right word, but opportunities made available to you to be able to even get to the point where you're able to speak to someone.
Absolutely.
Which is just awful that's
and it probably depends on your upbringing and maybe your school and things like that to some extent, and also your own intelligence and your own coping strategies, your own coping and what's happened to you in the life, all those things, make you able to do things or not, and I mean, it's like, and it's about feeling safe, I think, a lot of the time. I think particularly with autism, it creates an awful lot of people with autism have high anxiety, particularly in any social situation when they have to deal with people, because they're not quite sure how to behave, they're not quite sure they're getting it right. And that's really hard. So everything's a hurdle, particularly involving talking to people, counsellors, things like that. Obviously, if you're dealing with anxiety, there's things, if you've done it before, it might be a bit easier if someone has helped you get over those things. If someone has and it might be a counsellor, it might be a support worker, if someone's helped you do those things, you might eventually be able to go to a job interview or book a counselling appointment or whatever it is. And you might appear to be perfectly okay from the neurotypical point of view, but actually you really struggle with some things. And I think that lack of support sometimes is important. So if you've got very supportive family or supportive friends, you might be okay. But there's things that that lack sometimes is really hard. Yeah.
And it almost feels like, this probably might not be the right thing to say, but it's almost like you need luck on your side.
Absolutely.
For socioeconomic status, you've got to be lucky or fortunate enough to have the right support network, are you in the right authority for the school system, the right NHS trust, all those services coming together to be able to help you. A lot of it feels like pure luck, which is so not okay.
Not necessarily counselling, but most of the young people I've worked with, and adults, if they've been supported and helped to get the help they need, they'll probably do a bit better, and they'll know how to get that then. And if they haven't done that, they haven't been supported, they're going to struggle, and that's not to say that it's always the parents' fault not helping. People are affected by neurodiversities very differently. And it's not just that, there's, so it's important people don't feel blamed, really. It's giving people support to help them reach something like their potential, maybe. Certainly as young people, and as counsellors, we try and do that for everybody. It's about people wanting, where do you want to get to? What do you want to be able to do? What could you do more? And things like that. It's like, where do you want to be? And helping people get to where they want to be. And that could be very different for very many people. But there are people who, they don't have that support, so their potential, they'll never get near their potential or close to what they want to do because they just need more help and it isn't there. So that can be quite hard. And if they had a different background, they'd be doing something very, very different. I'm thinking, I can't go into details, but I'm thinking of people I work with who exactly that. If this person had a different background, they'd be running the country by now. That's not that hard, is it? They've been the key for running. I think they'd be doing, having a very fulfilling job probably, and at the moment they probably haven't, and they probably haven't done anything work-wise, because they haven't got that little bit of support. Maybe even an hour or two a week, just someone going, should we fill in this application form or something like that,
Hopefully, I mean, everything takes time. I think even to now recognise neurodiversity as that, it is neurodiversities. It's not the image that you just described of an autistic person, for example. That's being recognised. I think that there is a journey that we're going through globally. In terms of acknowledging and recognising neurodiverse individuals and how neurotypical should be working around that. I think there's a long way to go, and I don't know anywhere near enough on the topic to even really be commenting on that kind of level, but I know that there are limitations out there in terms of support. I get asked it all the time, what can you do from an EAP or SAP, and I'm like, well, we're not in a position to diagnose or anything like that. But then one of the questions that I talked to you about beforehand, how does someone get a diagnosis? You rightfully pointed out to me outside of this, what does that matter to the individual? What will that diagnosis bring about for the individual? Is it important, or is it more about them for their own personal kind of...
Would it be useful? Do you want it? Is someone telling you to get that diagnosis they can fill in a form, or do you want it? Is that useful? Is that something that would help you in your job or education or whatever? Or probably more importantly, help you realise that it's not your fault. And I think that a lot of stories you read of people who've been diagnosed either with autism or ADHD, I'm thinking particularly, they find out maybe as adults. And that is something that particularly affects women, actually. There's a real mismatch or a difference between how many boys and how many girls are diagnosed with autism. It's like 3 to 1. Used to be 4 to 1, yeah. And there's no genetic reason for that. Most of the neurodiversities are genetic and they're orange, and probably, well, that's a bit complicated. But there's no reason for that other than we're just not diagnosing them because we're missing things. Yeah. And people as adults, a lot of women, some men are discovering in their 30s and 40s, they're like, oh, you know, they discover they have autism, for example, and then there's this huge revelation and relief almost. It's almost like, you know, there are people who think, oh, so the reason I find it really hard to go to social gatherings isn't because there's something wrong with me, or it's because I have autism. That makes sense. Yeah. It almost gives them permission to be themselves. People who struggle with dating and personal relationships, things like that, all sorts of things. That I think for some people it's this rush of relief. You know, interestingly, a lot of the time once you get a diagnosis, what then? And the answer is not a lot. There's not very little post-diagnostic support. And there are organisations starting to think about that, particularly for adults. Yeah. And I think that's where counselling can really come in. It's like, what does it mean to you? You know, what can... And I think probably the most important thing with neurodiversities is learning about what you're good at, learning where your strengths are, learning what makes you feel okay. And then feeling okay not to do the things that don't make you feel okay. Yes. Learning what support you need to get those strengths. Learning the things, thinking about the things that work from a solution-focused counsellor's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Work on what works. Think about what's okay. And that's hard to notice. So
do you think, so you don't need to have specialist interventions necessarily or specialist support if you have been, you know, diagnosed with a condition, or you suspect you might have a condition or traits potentially. You don't need to then get specialist clinical support beyond that to help pull out those great things, you know, and work on things to enhance and enrich your life. You don't need to be, you know, assigned treatment perhaps. You know, you could use...
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, Kayleigh. I think one of the reasons I got into solution-focused counselling, which is my preferred modality, is because it's there are books that tell me it works well with people with autism. So obviously I ought to learn that one. Obviously what works is what works for you. Yeah, it's different for everyone. Yeah. And I think, I think that the input in terms of counselling and therapy and helping with neurodiversity, or helping people who are struggling with the effects of neurodiversity, which is the important thing, I think that the counsellor or therapist doesn't need to be a specialist, but it probably helps that they have some understanding. You know, they need to empathise with each other. Yeah. And that might take a bit longer. There is something called an empathy gap or an empathy bridge. You know, it's if someone thinks differently from you, it might take a little bit longer for you to get each other. And that's one of the most important things in counselling. And it's not impossible. It just might take a little time. You need to check, as a counsellor, you need to check the other person understands you. You need to check it makes sense. And you might do that. I mean, I quite often work with bits of paper and diagrams and things like that, and particularly for people with different neurodiversities, or anybody, using pictorial stuff as well as a check of understanding. Yeah. Because obviously you may have noticed I talk quite a lot. However, talking isn't great for everybody. Especially not this much.
Works for me. It's fine.
Good. We're okay. So you have to make sure that you've got that shared understanding of what's going on. I think it's really important. So you don't need to have reams of qualifications to be an autism counsellor. And I think the most important thing is you're not trying to fix the neurodiversity. I can't cure dyslexia. I wouldn't want to. A lot of people go, this is me. You know, this is my superpower, if you like. I'm really, really good at what I do because I'm autistic. Yes. Or I'm really focused on something that really interests me because I have this ADHD, badly named ADHD. You know, my focus is brilliant on something that really interests me. I'm good at this, you know. But helping to realise that and understand that is so important, you know. And I think, so I think a counsellor gives people space to reflect on that when they're skilled, and they need to. It's just about some understanding, maybe giving a bit more time, providing a reasonable adjustment. What would be a reasonable adjustment for counselling to help someone who's neurodiverse? Well, I think first on your list, a bit more time. so that you understand each other.
Yeah.
Just take that time to check you understand each other. I think that's important. I think, so yes, you don't need a specialist necessarily, but it's probably a good idea to talk to someone about how you feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so when I get approached quite often by, universities, employers, we need specialist interventions. I'm there, looking and speaking to clinical colleagues as well, going, there isn't a specialist magic wand here. There doesn't need to be. We need to just tailor the support that is provided to help. We can't deny those individuals access. If they have access, let's tailor the support we provide. Whilst we're not there to give a diagnosis, and we wouldn't diagnose anyone with depression on the helpline. That's not our role. There are ways to do that, but ultimately, what like we said, what is that diagnosis for? When someone is considering getting diagnosed for their suspected depression, what actually is that going to do for them? Do they want it for themselves? Do they want it for work? Do they want it for school? What is it? And I think it's the same here, and experience is what's key, here. And it's the same with, a counsellor that's never worked with bereavement isn't going to be the right person to support someone with complex grief, necessarily.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But it's the connection. Do they connect?
Yeah.
It might be all right,
Yeah,
it's like, some experience might be useful, but not vital.
Connection,
connection. Good. And I think one of the biggest things in counselling is that the client feels safe. Yeah.
Yes.
So if some neurodiversities create quite a lot of anxiety and things like that, they reduce your feelings of safety day to day, because you're going to work, you're going to school, you're in society, and it feels scary and horrible because any point you could be expected to do something that just makes sense for a lot of neurotypical people to make sense to you, whatever it is. Expect to do something that basically isn't you. Now, if your counsellor also creates those feelings, you've got the wrong counsellor. However, if as counsellors we can help people feel safe and feel okay in that situation, that's the most important thing. Same for counselling anybody. It's that feeling of safety, that feeling of it's okay. Whatever it is, it's okay. And I think that's particularly, and I think that we might, if we were counsellors, we might assume people understand things about counselling. We might assume people have understanding about social things to do with how we're going to do it. And actually, they might not. So we need to make sure we're explaining things carefully. Recently, we do a clinical assessment in our job where we assess people. And recently, I read through the questions to somebody so that the next time they phoned up, they would be ready for doing that clinical assessment. Because very often, and this was someone with autism, I asked them if they wanted me to do that. I didn't just do it. I said, do you want me to do that? Would that make it helpful? Oh, yeah. So you read through the questions. And that means someone's prepared for what's coming up. And that can be a big thing. Make sure people understand what's coming up so they feel safe. And feeling safe is important for everybody. And it's a big thing for people, often with neurodiversity, for a lot of people, because then they don't have to really, really try hard to not be themselves, which is the hard bit. And have to pretend they can do things that they find difficult if they're dyslexic or something like that. So
gosh, I didn't even think about that with the clinical assessment. That's a really good.
I've only done it once, but I thought it was a great idea.
It absolutely is.
Do you want me to read it? Yeah, okay, good, we'll do that. And that would be standard practice in a school, particularly one that works with people with autism. Explain what's coming up. That can be really helpful. Not always, but it can be. With
someone that might be neurodiverse, do you think it would be more likely that they might need to trial potentially a couple of different counsellors? And it's more important. I mean, it's important for anyone that's engaged in counselling to find the right fit, and it can happen when there isn't. We see that. And someone might need to ask to be assigned a new counsellor because the fit isn't there. And again, that's like making friends. Forming relationships. There needs to be some kind of gel there, and therapeutic alliance. I think we kind of refer to it as, if it might be more difficult for an individual to find that trust, forge that relationship. I think to anyone listening, then it's more than okay to ask for something different. Like, don't be afraid to say, I don't think this is working for me. I don't think this is the right approach. Some clinicians might be very direct in that and make assumptions that people might understand the clinical processes, and that's fine for some people, but other people may need, like you say, extra time and things like that. So I think it's fine to ask for something different if you don't like what
Yes.
you've got.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I think for anybody it is, but I think, and it actually knowing that it's okay to ask.
Yeah.
Because if you've gone through life and everything seems to be your fault because you keep not doing things right and you keep getting like B's and C's in school instead of A's despite being the cleverest kid in the class or whatever, you wonder what is going on. Oh, well, I've got this counsellor, right? The counsellor will help me. Oh, that's not gone well. Oh, it must be my fault. There must be something wrong with me. Actually, the counselling research is that the most important factor in effective counselling for anybody is that therapeutic alliance, that working relationship that you click with the counsellor. Yeah. Okay. Really important for neurodiverse people as well. And I think it's just that you have permission to do this differently. If this doesn't work, it's not your fault.
Absolutely.
Because you can imagine otherwise, you then think that's your fault and then you'll never do it again, or you just end up with a string of counsellors and you blame yourself each time. Yeah. More often than not, the counsellors aren't quite reaching the right direction. And I mean, some of the old literature, the old academic literature about particularly psychoanalysts with people with autism, maybe we're talking quite a long time ago. It's awful because they're just blaming the client for not being very good at therapy, which is unbelievable. But people wrote academic papers about that. I can't believe it. It's like, it's a, what? It's the counsellor's responsibility. But I think, and it is that, yes, you can choose this counsellor. They're okay. No, I don't want them. I want someone else different. That's fine. That's not your fault. I mean, obviously, if you end up going through about 10, there's something maybe you haven't found the right one yet. That's quite hard. That could be quite worrying as well. So maybe there's a sort of system around, actually, let's have a couple of sessions and see how we go on.
Yes.
Let's see if we can both work to get this better. Let's see if we can build that empathy bridge so we can work with each other. And that can take time. And I know from work, non-counselling work with young people, that takes time with any young person. Any person really, but counselling particularly. So, maybe it's a sort of, that needs a bit of management, doesn't it, really? But it is important to know that you have permission to not go to counselling. Here's 6 sessions of counselling. Oh, thank you. Oh, I hated the first one, but I had to go to the other 5 because that was the rules. No, you don't. And that's not your fault if you don't. And that's important. It's a good point. I've not thought about Kayleigh. So massive. And maybe a reasonable adjustment would be to give that extra session if it is difficult.
Absolutely.
That might be an interesting thing. We'll have to talk to the boss about that.
Yeah, we'll go back. No, absolutely. I think that's really important to highlight. I think very conscious that this is a conversation that I could sit and have for hours. It's so fascinating, and I am like obsessed with your energy and enthusiasm for it. I love it. It's so inspiring and so fascinating. I think for people that are listening, if they don't really know where to start, because we've gone quite high level here, but if people don't know where to start in terms of getting support, not necessarily a diagnosis, what would you suggest, kind of, whether it's themselves or they're concerned about a loved one, resources, kind of services, charities, specialist provisions? What would you suggest as a starting point?
Well, I mean, those things exactly. Yes. So, if you think you might have autism, have a look on the National Autistic Society website. It's excellent. Really good, useful stuff. Quite a lot of it is based around children, because obviously a lot of people get first diagnosed in the children, but there is stuff for adults there as well. You might have to search for it. So you might find, obviously these websites are built for everybody. So you might find if you look at one of these websites, and you think, oh, that's not for me, just keep looking a bit, because there might be stuff that will be useful in there. It just might be a bit hidden, ADHD Foundation, we've worked with ourselves in Health Assured. They came to talk to us recently, and all the other, other neurodiversities have those main charities, websites, support groups. So they're a good start. I think talking to your GP if you're looking at diagnosis and things, it's a long process, particularly if you're a grown-up. It takes long enough for young people, and that can be a real problem. I've worked with people sort of 12, 13 who should have been diagnosed with autism years ago, and they haven't been due to something going on with school. And they're really struggling at secondary school because they're not given the support they need. And that's rubbish, But think about whether you want a diagnosis. Do you want that? Is that what you want? Would it be useful for you? Do you want that? How would it help you? And again, that might be something counselling can help with. Have a think about it. Do you want this? Are you doing it for someone else? Are you doing it for you? But it's not easy. And I mean, some people end up going private, talk to a clinical psychologist, things like that. And it's not easy to even get qualified to diagnose people. So there's not many people who can do it, which is but start with those organisations, those support groups. and see where you go from there. No, I think it's probably the best thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And any, kind of concerns, anyone that's listening that uses ourselves as an SAP, EAP, whatever, if you're not sure where to start, you want to, some pointers on signposting, we are very lucky to have a big clinical kind of pool of, resource and guidance and stuff. So if you're not sure where to start, we can help. So if you do need some pointers, we're there, but don't see things like because you don't have a diagnosis or whatever as a blocker. Like you've said, is it needed? What does the individual want it for? Or is it actually, just want to talk to someone, space to reflect, work out what is right for you? Or, if you're worried about someone else, that understanding what the counselling space can provide, someone that is potentially neurodiverse or has had a diagnosis, there is still space in the counselling world to support that individual without formal specialist treatment. That shouldn't be seen as a blocker or like a brick wall to that for that person.
And I think it is the support there is to not necessarily with the diversity specifically, it's how does it affect you? And how can we help you make those effects less bad? Yeah, and help you think about your strengths and what you could be doing, if that's useful, because it's your stuff.
Very powerful. Thank you. Is there anything that you want to kind of add at all? Anything that you think is really important that you want to make sure that the listeners, the people watching, that they've got everything that they need to know?
No, I think we've covered most of the things I was talking about. I think, just remember a lot of these diagnoses originally were made by people outside, the people who don't have neurodiversities, by what they could see.
Yeah.
That's not a good way of diagnosing someone. I don't think you diagnose a broken leg by sitting the other side of the room and thinking someone, you have to look, there's have to be an x-ray, there's a I think, and I think because of that, I think the problems that causes is people, it's society judging you, really.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to be that, because it can be your diagnosis if that's what you want, if you need it. But remember that that's where they started, and that's not great. So, what do you need it for, and how can you use it? Yeah, it doesn't have to be someone else pointing out what you can't do. It's about you knowing what you can do and what would be good, and what your strengths are. Yeah, and if getting that diagnosis is part of it, crack on. Good luck.
What a very good way to end this. Thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed talking about
And you, Kayleigh, thank you. I think I've come up with some ideas. Great.
Fantastic. Thank you.